I think we should talk up to Charismatic Catholic, who is not, you guys, Canadian Catholic. That is not who he is. He's a different person. We actually like this guy, I think.
Charismatic Catholic, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you guys.
Awesome.
Are you sure you're not Canadian Catholic?
If you're asking if I have absolute certainty, no, but I'm pretty confident that I'm not Canadian Catholic.
Coming from the other side of the aisle, that was a beautiful answer.
Beautiful. All right.
So what did you want to talk
about? Yeah, so I guess I just kind of want to, considering it's the Easter season, for us, I would just kind of ask you guys if you would say, or if you think believing that Jesus died and rose from the dead 3 days later is unreasonable.
Well, given our understanding of these things, then yeah. I mean, here's the problem. Charismatic Catholic, can I call you something else? That is way too many syllables.
All right, I'll say you could call me Andy. How about
Andy?
that?
Andy, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay, so Andy.
Yeah.
Here's the deal. If I get really, really creative, I could imagine, hey, what if we created a technology that in the future we would be able to use that technology to bring people essentially back from the dead, right? We were able to revive them in some way and their brain not be mush. I don't think that's, I'm pretty sure that's not possible because you decompose sooner than that. But let's just say that we know there's this advanced technology that does it. If that was the case, then I would say, okay, maybe possibly I could imagine that being the case. But if that was, it would be entirely unremarkable. The claim made in the Bible isn't that it was a technology, it was that it was a power. And this like powers of God, and that Jesus resurrected that way. And I don't think that's possible. And I think it's reasonable to say that because we don't have experience with powers from God. And because of that, it's just a claim in a book. And there are lots of claims in lots of books, right? There's a claim that Muhammad split the moon and put it back together. Andy, do you believe that Muhammad split the moon and put it back together?
I guess I don't, I'm not read up enough on this to give you a definitive answer on that, Eric.
Do you think the moon was split in half and put back together, though?
Do I believe it? No.
But why not? The evidence is right there. I mean, it's back in one piece, isn't it?
Sure.
It's not in two pieces,
sure.
Right?
But this is Sure, but this is now me talking about whether or not I believe it's reasonable to believe, whether or not I believe it's reasonable to believe that. Yeah. The initial question was, I get that you're saying that you think it, I get that you're saying you think it's reasonable not to believe it, but the initial question was, do you think it's unreasonable for me,
Absolutely.
for a Christian,
right.
to believe it? Okay, why? Okay, so what would be the reason for that?
So we're using reasoning in two different ways. Mm-hmm. And I understand your definition of reasoning. Totally get it. I want to give you my definition because I feel like that's useful in this context. Can you provide evidence to support it? Right? Because for me to say, hey, I believe that some, I don't know, unicorns came into my house and painted me a picture and then got rid of it magically before I left, before I came downstairs, right? I can say, hey, you know,
or like the someone broke into my house and replaced all of my furniture with exact duplicates.
Yeah, sure.
It's like, okay, well.
Yeah, absolutely. And so for me to say, is that reasonable for me to say that somebody broke into my house, replaced all of that? Well, I don't think it's reasonable, but here's the deal. If we're using your definition of reasonable, it's more about internal consistency. And I think you can be internally consistent and wrong. What I care about is if I can show you that it's reasonable, if I can say, hey, here's why I believe it's reasonable and walk you through the steps. You know, maybe everything's brand new and the tags are still on and the door's broken. You know, like that would be, those would be what I would use to show you evidence of that, and that's why I think it's reasonable.
Right.
So,
Can I rephrase slightly?
Yeah.
The way we talk about something being reasonable, the standard I hold myself to is this thing that I believe reasonable. That is hinged on, can I accurately describe it in a way to somebody who doesn't share my preconceptions and have them agree with me that it is reasonable? That's kind of a good baseline to be like, okay, is this a reasonable claim? Well, I'm going to go to somebody else and I'm going to explain it to the best of my ability with all the information that I've got, and expect them to also find it to be a reasonable claim, even though they don't share my preconceptions or my personal experiences or anything that is unique to me. And that is a pretty good baseline for me to determine whether or not something I believe or am saying is reasonable. Now, do I think that the resurrection story is reasonable at that standard for you or anybody else? No, I don't. I don't think that you can get to a reasonable resurrection story without holding a lot of those preconceived notions that you do as a Christian and that I used to as a Christian. That said, if we're talking about internal consistency and looking at it purely through the filter of those preconceptions, then absolutely, I think that that is reasonable using that definition.
What V said.
Okay. So then what would you, if I were to use something like a three, we'll say Trent Warren's three-pronged approach to figuring out if my belief is reasonable or unreasonable, right? Like something like a three-pronged approach, like does the belief contradict, well-established facts about the subject? Is there a lack of evidence that we would expect if the event did occur? And then is the evidence of the unusual? I'm sure you're aware of this, but just for in case you weren't, I thought it was spelled out. And what would be?
Here's the interesting thing, and I can answer that really quickly. The Trent Horn three-pronged approach is a approach that is from someone who also believes what you believe. And so it's not surprising to me that they found ways to filter everything out, but still keep their belief secure.
Honestly, with Trent Horn's three-pronged approach, I actually pretty much agree with. Like the three things that you have to look for in order to make sure a thing is reasonable. I just think that he's grandfathering in a bunch of preconceptions, especially in that first one with facts about a thing. So I think that, if you wanted to use that, but the trick there is making sure that you're interpreting everything as objectively as possible and not allowing your preconceptions to influence what you think are established facts or what you think is evidence or lack thereof, right? So that's a good place to start, but it certainly doesn't get you out of that little bubble that you would want to if you wanted to determine if something was true.
Okay, so you would have, I guess, touching on the first one then specifically, what's the pickle you see that I end up in by if I'm subscribing to this three-pronged approach? The first point, I mean,
right. Does it contradict established facts about the subject, right?
About the subject in question, yeah.
Right. The pickle there for me would be it's a pretty well-established fact that people don't rise from the dead.
Sure, and but like the something that we would use is like bodies in a cemetery. It's unreasonable to assume people rise from that everyone in the cemetery rises from the dead, because we can go and actually dig up the bodies in the caskets and like see them and be like, no, it's pretty unreasonable to say this person is walking around now. There's their body.
That's the second one, I believe, right? The second prong is a lack of evidence where you would expect it, correct?
Lack of evidence where you expect it would be the second prong. Yeah,
right.
But I'm still touching on the first prong here.
I feel like you're mixing them up. But my point here is that what you think is convincing, like that whole three-pronged approach is still dependent on what you personally think is convincing based on your preconceptions, right? And so how do we talk about those before we get into that three-pronged approach? Because if we're in line with what we believe to be convincing, we can apply that three-pronged approach and probably come to a pretty consistent understanding between us. It's just that we don't agree on what established facts look like in this context. For me, an established fact is once you're dead, especially after 3 days, right? There's no way you're going to rise up, especially, you know, like, and then
well, and in any cases where somebody is clinically dead for 2 minutes and is resurrected, and I'm using the resurrected word very intentionally because, yeah, you were dead on the operating table for like 2 solid minutes. The fact that they brought you back is not remarkable in the same way that the Jesus ascending bodily into heaven, not just rising from the dead, like.
Well, even the dead for 2 seconds, like you're not brain dead.
But
if you're brain dead, you're dead.
If you're dead, everything is dead.
No, if you're not, your brain stays active.
True. I'm specifically talking about Jesus. Like Jesus had the holes in his hands, all of those things. It's not like Jesus was healed. But anyway, yeah, I don't think it's reasonable because I don't think that. Yeah, as V said, I really don't know if I have anything to add to the conversation anymore. V kind of tied that up really well.
Thank you. So, Andy, essentially what I would say is my version of reasonable is determining does it fit reality, regardless of who is looking at it and what their preconceptions are. And the three-pronged approach, I don't necessarily have a problem with, but it doesn't get you away from those preconceptions. So it still relies on you having your internally consistent narrative and applying that to these 3 prongs. So it sounds very reasonable, but it's not actually asking you to evaluate the claims independently of each other. And that is where we're going to come across a lot of these problems and a lot of these disagreements.
Fair enough. I think I think I see where because I would say that I would agree with a lot of most of what you said, but I would say like in discussing this, we're talking about you, me, Eric. We're talking about us as human beings, whereas in this 3-pronged approach that I'm using, I'm trying to apply it to the Son of God, and I think that is I'm seeing now. I think that's probably where when you're talking about preconceptions, bringing it to the table. I think that might be what you're talking about.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, you're bringing a supernatural element into it that we haven't talked about yet, and so that's kind of where we're hitting that rut.
Yeah, I mean, I was
fair enough.
Yeah, I was told that Jesus was 100% human and 100% God, which doesn't make any sense, but that also means that what applies to humans would also apply. Like the Venn diagram of characteristics of Jesus would mean that when that person died, they stayed dead because they're a human. But anyway,
good question, good conversation. I think the first real good conversation of the afternoon. So,
Alan, thank you for calling, man.
Thanks, guys.